Hey everyone, just a quick note on this episode. Andrew was on location when we recorded it, and the audio quality is not quite where we usually like it to be. It may not bother you, but we hope that if it does, you'll enjoy the episode anyway. Now let's get to it. Hey everybody, welcome to Open Door Philosophy, a podcast about philosophy, made accessible for listeners. I'm Andrew's former philosophy teacher, Derek Parsons.
And I'm Mr. Parsons' former philosophy student, Andrew Graziano. Welcome to episode 32, where we conclude our series on Pierre Hadot's essay, Spiritual Exercises, from his book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. But before we jump into that, Mr. Parsons, how's it been going?
It's been going great. It is summertime. It's summertime. We're done with school. It is beautiful outside. We're getting ready to travel the country. So happy about that. But I did want to mention, because people like book recommendations and stuff like that, as the school year is sadly coming to a close, I do actually get pretty sad about seeing my students go, especially the ones who have done 2 years of philosophy with me, which is a lot of philosophy and a lot of me. God bless those students. But I always give them, it's always a small class. I have 6 students this year. I always give them parting gifts. I give them books that I feel like is books that, throughout the 2 years, they sort of seem to lean one direction or another, with this philosopher or that. So I just wanted real quick to say the books I've gotten them.
That's awesome.
So yeah. So here we go around the table in my mind. So the first is Becoming Beauvoir, which is a biography on the French existentialist Simone de Beauvoir. The second is Mary Midgley's The Myths We Live By, which is a fantastic book on really kind of seeing what lies underneath the surface using philosophical method and all that. The next is How to Be a Stoic by Massimo Pigliucci, which is a classic. I don't know if it's a classic. It's a modern classic. How about that? Great instruction on Stoicism. The next is definitely a classic. That's Henry David Thoreau's Walden. So I have a student who really enjoyed transcendentalism. And then the last two are Religious in Nature. One student is getting Augustine's Confessions. And then the last student is getting a biography on Saint Teresa of Avila.
Oh, wow.
So I'm really excited to give that to them. That'll be next week. Just to say goodbye to them and thank them for their time and company. So anyway, end of the year.
That's awesome. Yeah. Congratulations to Mr. Parsons, IB, HL, and SL, I guess, to philosophy students. That's a really fun class, and I'm sure they enjoyed it a lot. And it sounds like you're parting with them in a really meaningful way.
Yeah. Well, how about you? The shackles of school are off of you. You've shed
Shackles of school are off. Yeah. I'll do a reading update also, because I think this will be an actual update. So I think last summer we talked about the Count of Monte Cristo.
Yes.
I've been beating that book to death, trying to get through it. It's the unabridged copy, and
That's
I'm
right,
almost
the unabridged.
So close to being finished. I think this week I will finish that book. So excited, and I'm going to be picking up Dante too. I've read it before, but not as in detail as I'd like. So I think that's the next big classic. So very excited about that. I've been watching. People are probably familiar with this, but Yale University has these like online open Yale courses, and they have this one free course online that's called Dante in Translation that I've been watching, and it's really fantastic. It's like, let me see, 24 lectures, and it's really good. So recommend that to everybody.
Oh, wow. I used to teach the Inferno years ago.
Really?
Yeah, it was one of my earliest books that I was exposed to. I guess when I say books, I mean like something outside of whatever, Chronicles of Narnia or something. Yeah, this is one of the first big sort of serious books I read, and I've loved it ever since.
Now that I'm going to say this is a interesting fact that I learned, and it's relating to something you just said, but in the Yale courses online, they were talking about, well, Augustine's a big influence on Dante, apparently. So maybe your student who's finishing up Confessions, after you give it to them, will do Dante next. But someone who influenced Augustine too was the poet Virgil, who's prominent in the Aeneid, or not in the Aeneid. He wrote the Aeneid, but he's prominent in Inferno, of course. And apparently, in Augustine's time and in Dante's time, Virgil wasn't seen as this like great epic poet. He was seen as this great Neoplatonic philosopher, which I think is really cool. So
that is interesting. Yeah, Dante's Divine Comedy is a world classic, and everyone should read it.
Yeah.
Stop. Hard stop. Everyone should read it. Period. All right, everybody. So, last episode we went over Pierre Hadot's essay called Spiritual Exercises from his book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. And we unpacked what was in that essay, which essentially provides from a sort of classical or ancient standpoint from Greece and Rome, how to incorporate philosophy as a way of living rather than having it be some sort of ivory tower topic or course of study that deals with abstract theory, that it would be more so practical to how to live a good life. So if you haven't listened to that episode, what we're going to talk about today is really kind of our commentary and analysis of that text. Last episode, we really just kind of unpacked what was in that essay. So today's going to be a bit of analysis. Should be good stuff. So there it is. So to get us going, I don't know, is there anything you want to say to like, did I miss anything in recapping? That was a very short recap.
No, I think it was a good recap. Definitely, this episode is going to make a lot more sense if you have listened to the last episode for a little bit of context. Yeah, I think this is going to be a really fun episode, so I'm looking forward to it.
All right, well, what do you got?
All right, so I'm going to start kind of towards the beginning when Hadot, excuse my French, pardon my French.
Pardon your French.
We're going to start close to the beginning. In section 1, Learning to Live, where Hadot is introducing these spiritual exercises. It's kind of close to the beginning. He's introducing it, so I'm going to read the passage, and then I'm going to toss it to Mr. Parsons. Well, I don't even know how it's going to go, so I'm just going to read it, and then we'll see where it takes us. How's about that?
All right.
This is not scripted for those who are listening. Authentic comments. I'll give a little bit of context to this passage too, so I think that'll be helpful. So Hadot's talking about spiritual exercises, introducing them, like I said, and then he's telling us that spiritual exercises came out of these Hellenistic and Roman schools of philosophy. I'll talk more about that in a second and why I mentioned it. But Hadot says, in the view of all philosophical schools, mankind's principal cause of suffering, disorder, and unconsciousness were the passions, that is, unregulated desires and exaggerated fears. That's the main part that I wanted to read, but I'll continue a little further. Each school had its own therapeutic method, but all of them linked their therapeutics to a profound transformation of the individual's mode of seeing. And the object of spiritual exercise is precisely to bring about this transformation. So, 2 questions that I have for you, Mr. Parsons. So, first question that I have for you is, 2,000 years later, I want to get your take on this idea. First off, are all of mankind's struggles in the world due to their passions? That's a very bold claim that Hadot attributes to these Hellenistic schools.
Yeah, so I think when we say all of mankind's, problems or whatever arise from our passions, it's important to note exactly what types of passions Hadot is talking about. And I think it's those types of passions that we say when we sort of lose ourselves in a negative way. Now you might say you're passionate about, say, art, and you love going to museums, or you love going to the opera, and you might get sort of lost in that story or lost in that painting that you're really just taking a lot of time being involved with it. And I don't know that has anything negative to do with, has a negative impact on who you are as a person and your virtues. But now if we say the passion of anger, right? Or lust or something like that. Well, now those are passions that we should not give into because those do negatively impact our virtues. But at the same time, we equally get as lost in those, I suppose. And that's like when people advise like, oh man, get your head under control. You're being way too emotional about this. When we're angry or jealous or something like that, that's an appeal to reason.
Mm.
And so, I think the notion is that by losing ourselves in those emotions, we are, in a sense, negating our authenticity because we're not being our true self. But I suppose a counter argument to that is there anything valuable or beneficial about the passions?
I don't really know how I feel about this. I think Edo is making a general oversimplification of these Hellenistic schools, and he's known as a Neoplatonist, kind of a modern Neoplatonist. And I can see this kind of oversimplification brought on by Neoplatonism, his view of Neoplatonism, and kind of projecting that on these Hellenistic schools. Because I don't think that not all of them would say that all of mankind's problems are due to these passions. I don't think Aristotelian would say that necessarily. They would say passions are a reason that human beings suffer, but they're not the only reason that humans suffer. And I'm not as familiar with the other Hellenistic schools other than Platonism. Aristotelianism and Stoicism, but I believe maybe one or two other ones would also make that same claim as an Aristotelian.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely think that it's interesting. It's an interesting point, and just because I think he's oversimplifying that point doesn't really mean that his argument about getting rid of these passions or these passions being bad is wrong. Just I think he oversimplifies it in a way that I'm not necessarily that happy about, but that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, all these ancient schools definitely put human reasoning, on a pedestal. It's the spark of Zeus that is within us. If you go with the classic Plato's example of the tripartite soul, whereas there's three parts to us, we have our urges, which we share with the animals. We have our spirited aspect, which is these passions we're talking about. And then we have our rational part. And it is the rational part that is the thing that can control the urges and the passions, spirited aspect of us. That's the importance that's the reason why we need to hone and do these spiritual practices, hone that reason so that when those situations come up, we can apply our reason to those things. And I think, like you said, yeah, I mean, it does. And these ancients are right. Like our passions can get us into a whole lot of trouble.
Oh, yeah. Everybody's familiar with that, I think, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's got to be a universal human sort of experience.
I'm trying to think of an example, but I don't really have a good one. I know that the one that one of my professors at school always uses is like this donut example. And I might have used this on the podcast before too. I always like to mention this one. It's like, sometimes you have a box of donuts in front of you. Here, I'll use an antidote from my own life. Sometimes when I haven't been over I have been over in a few years, but I haven't been over this early in a few years. But I remember when I was younger, sometimes, very occasionally, we would stop by my grandmother's and my grandparents' house in the morning. And I remember they'd have this box of like Shipley's donuts. And I loved Shipley's donuts, these Shipley's glazed donuts. I think they're the best donuts ever. And I remember that like I'd always want to eat one. And even if I would have like a big breakfast or something before, and so I'd eat one of these Shipley's donuts, even though I knew that I probably shouldn't have one because I was full. And then my stomach would be like upset like an hour or 30 minutes later. It's like this, I wouldn't be in this pain if my desire for donuts weren't so high or something, And so I think that's like a very simple example of Ado is talking about here.
Yeah, sure. And if you want to, take that example, because it's really an example of moderation, right? Which is temperance is one of the 4 Stoic cardinal virtues, which I believe come from Aristotle. So it's all connected. Yeah, so if you take moderation like donuts, my students are very well aware of my struggle with donuts. Oh, mama. But you can take that same issue of moderation, say like applying it to, say, gambling, or any other thing that requires moderation, drinking too much or something like that. So passions can get us into a whole lot of trouble. I did want to bring up one other thing, though, related to passion and existentialism. So the existentialist place a great deal of emphasis on passion, and that it is in fact our passionate involvement in life which brings us into greater authenticity. Now, I don't think, and especially so with, say, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. In fact, it was Kierkegaard who was highly critical of Christians in his time, that they were not passionate enough about the religion. Nietzsche, who was an atheist, didn't care so much for that, but he also said that like passion in living was the thing that brings us into greater authenticity. So whether it's authenticity with God or authenticity with living, the existentialist really placed a great focus or emphasis on that. But now I don't think that Nietzsche or Kierkegaard are talking about passion in the same way as perhaps Adot is, whereas Adot is talking about these passions that are vicious, whereas I don't know that, and I'm speaking really out of turn here, but I don't know that Nietzsche'd be like, get drunk all the time.
I don't think you would say that.
I don't think that's the type of passion he's talking about, but the passion of embracing life fully. Apollonian mindset versus the Dionysian mindset, embracing that Dionysian side of you, that wild, chaotic sort of madness that's beautiful when enjoying life. He says it's a really important part of ourselves, whereas the Apollonian side of ourselves is that rational part. So both parts are important to existentialists. So kind of a counter argument in a way from the existentialist school.
Yeah, I think Hume is kind of in a similar position. Hume said that reason is the slave to passion, and that passion is the thing that's driving you, just like you're saying with these existentialists. Let me say one more thing I want to come back and explain why I don't think, the more I'm thinking about it, I don't even know if a Platonist would always agree with this either, what he's claiming, because it's not really, maybe he would, or maybe a Platonist would, I'm not sure, but I think this is important to note, and this is where half of the Hellenistic schools, Neoplatonism and Platonism, Stoicism, and I think one more, are going to firmly say that, I think Epicureanism are going to say that all human beings are going to be able to use their reason to kind of escape their passions in some way. That's available to all human beings. Whereas the other half of these Hellenistic schools are going to say, no, most human beings are not going to be able to, not even really, even Platonism is going to lean this way, I think. Definitely not Stoicism. Half of these schools are going to say a lot of people are not going to be able to use their reason in such a way that they can, I think they would say that they can't do these spiritual exercises, or these spiritual exercises are not going to work to free them from their passions. Aristotle would say that he has this idea of natural slaves in the politics. So that's another reason that I think this is a little bit oversimplified. All philosophical schools, no, I'm not quite convinced about that, but it's okay. It's a passionate statement. Yes.
So one of the things I wanted to bring up, and you've alluded to this a little bit. Yeah, Adot is a Neoplatonist and an idealist. Some of the language that he uses throughout the paper is a bit ecstatic and rhapsodic, which is fine. I like that. That is passionate. And it reminds me a lot of some of my other favorite authors as well. Of course, Nietzsche was just wildly rhapsodic, but Emerson as well uses just such lofty Platonic type language, And so Adot, like just throughout the work, but especially in the fourth section on learning how to read, he says things like spiritual exercises are required for the healing of the soul, and we're pointing towards the perfection of the soul. There's a lot of these sort of out there Platonic ideas, if you will, like world of forms, ascension to all of this, and almost to the point where we negate our individuality in trying to achieve this higher level of being. And I don't really have a specific criticism of that, but I was just kind of curious, from your perspective, if that's something that stood out to you as well. Is that good? Is there another way he should have written these types of things, or is this type of language, this a static language, helpful for this?
No, I think that's a really great question. Often we don't pay enough attention when we're reading a piece of philosophy to, I don't know if this is the right word, kind of the diction he uses and the passionate nature of it. And I think this is really a really great point that you're bringing up. I think this is speaking towards the second section of the essay, learning to dialogue. So I'm wondering if he's doing this on purpose by being so passionate, by making maybe some bold statements like I was kind of complaining about. That's in a sense a way that Ado is encouraging the reader to learn how to dialogue with the text in a very, very easy way to do. This reading is very accessible, and it might be from this passion that's in pretty much every sentence, And so maybe convinced is not the right word, but I would not be surprised if he's intentionally doing this in a way that's kind of corresponding to section 2, where he's talking about how we're needing, when we read pieces of philosophy, we need to kind of engage in a dialogue with it. And it's kind of an exercise of its own. Reading a work of philosophy, it's an exercise of its own. So I guess sections 2 and 3, right? Or sections 2 and 4.
Yeah, he gets especially abstract in that area, which again, like I say, I like. It reminds me a lot too of Platonius. I think I'm saying that right. His Aeneids. Platonius is probably the best known Neoplatonist. And, a couple of weeks ago, preparing for a course, I was reading his section on beauty, and so we're talking about beauty in the Platonic sense. And of course, all that has to do with the world of forms and moving from vulgarity to absolute beauty and stuff like that. And it's just so wonderful to read, and it's inspiring, but just didn't know if there's some reason to be critical of it as well.
I don't know if it's, in my opinion, if it's for that purpose of emphasizing what he's talking about in 2 and 4.
In a way, it strikes me as kind of like praise. How like maybe you read Bible or some other religious text where someone's just really going off on praising God, and you do get into this type of elevated language to attempt to talk about the majesty of God. And I mean, that's what they're doing here with Platonic forms. They're talking about the majesty of that level of understanding truth, and truth is the ultimate good.
I've never read him before, but I would guess that this kind of majestic language that he's using is probably trying to inspire the reader to understand the beauty of these forms and the power and the difficulty of understanding of these forms. For a Neoplatonist, it's going to be very, very difficult to understand something like that and to ever understand what those forms are like. So maybe that passion is something both to try to allow the reader to understand how the author feels about these forms when he's understood them, or, probably also to inspire the reader to be more passionate about trying to achieve the ability to understand them. That'd be my guess. Let me ask you one more from this first section, because I think I really like this ending of this. So this is the very, very end of spiritual exercises, section 1. He's talking about these Epicurean spiritual exercises, but I think they're like these spiritual exercises as a whole. And I think they could all be considered kind of aiming towards this. Ado writes, each person was to tend towards creating the atmosphere in which hearts could flourish. The main goal was to be happy, and mutual affection and the confidence with which they relied upon each other contributed more than anything else to this happiness. So Ado is talking about friendship, a very, very important aspect of these Hellenistic schools, friendship is probably one of the most, if not the most important aspects in them. But I'm not as interested in that. I'm more interested in the main goal was to be happy, and each person was to tend towards creating the atmosphere in which hearts could flourish. And I think Ado's claiming that these spiritual exercises are for this aim. And I think this is something that we kind of hold true and that we hope philosophy can help us achieve. So I have 2 questions here as well, Mr. Parsons. The first one, which I think everyone can guess what you're going to say. But I think the first one is there some kind of value in that idea of philosophy allowing us to flourish or a key to allowing us to flourish, a necessary condition for allowing us to flourish and to reach us in happiness? Is there something towards that, or is this kind of a philosophical advertisement selling point?
I like that. No, absolutely. Like philosophy is essential to living a life that is flourishing. And I do prefer flourishing to say happy, even though, Aristotle specifically addresses happiness and says that that's an aim. He also uses eudaimonia, which we've talked about a lot on this podcast, flourishing. And I don't know I necessarily have to frame it as like philosophy is necessary for living a eudaimonic life, but rather perhaps it could say like the tools that philosophy employ in terms of being critical and self-reflection and those types of things are necessary in order to live a life that is flourishing.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. My second question, do you think that these like Hellenistic schools of philosophy possess some characteristic within these spiritual exercises or some aspect to these Hellenistic schools that is kind of fundamental to them and that may run throughout some other philosophical schools, but certainly not all, that uniquely allows them to push their adherents of the school towards eudaimonia, flourishing, happiness, whatever you want to say? Or is it that just philosophy in general is allowing people to reach this end goal?
Well, as a body of knowledge, I don't think it does that. Philosophy is so big, like philosophy of life is one aspect of philosophy. There's so much that's involved in philosophy, political philosophy, although it has to do with ethics, so that could have something to do with living a good life. But, you get some very abstract things about language and, philosophy of science and aesthetics. I mean, I guess all that kind of has to do with living a good life, but it's such a massive field. I mean, I find this for my own self. I want to read so many things, but to be really knowledgeable about one branch, gosh, you have to spend years on it. Mm-hmm. Because there's just so much. And so, I don't know that just philosophy, yes, maybe we sort of understand it as a single definition of one particular discipline. It's just so big. You could spend your entire life just engaging with philosophies of living, philosophies of life. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of what I think.
No, I agree with you. We've talked about this on the podcast too, but I hate these schools of philosophy that I think have become pretty mainstream in the 20th century, that in the last episode I mentioned that I think that those reacting against here that are so abstract that they hold no relation to living a good life. And if we hold that this is something that's kind of fundamental to philosophy, that philosophy is a way of trying to help live a good life, I think their relevance is kind of overstated. I'm thinking of Nick Bostrom's paper, Do We Live in a Computer Simulation, as my main, hated piece of philosophy. Yeah, I'm not sure if those very abstract fields of philosophy are necessarily going to help you live a better life as opposed to something like this.
Yeah, I think about consciousness, like that's one of those that I think is really in depth, and to truly understand like the scope of that particular branch of philosophy that deals with mind body. It's not terribly applicable or practical to living a good life, but it is all interconnected, because I think one of the things that underlies the questions of consciousness is whether or not we have free will. And in order to live a eudaimonic life based on our rational choices, we have to have free will.
Yep.
Right. And so in a way, but you have to take a couple of leaps, right? But in a way, consciousness does have something to do with how to live a good life, because it's the question of attempting to establish whether or not we have free will. And that's important. That's important to ethics. That's important to our rational choices. Even some of the most abstract subjects, they do, again, you have to kind of travel a couple of spaces along the little board game of philosophy. But they are there Can you read just a short little, wonderful little diagnosis or overview of consciousness to kind of wrap your head around that and then move on? Yeah, you probably can. The book that Jack Symes a couple episodes ago was we had him on our podcast. His book, Philosophers on Consciousness, is, like a 200-page book that covers really all the major themes of or theories of consciousness. And, is that enough if like your focus isn't consciousness? And probably, right?
The thing that I've really gotten out of university is that, like you're saying, all of philosophy is all the fields of philosophy are very connected with each other. For you to understand ethics to a high degree, it's inevitable that you're going to have a fundamental understanding of epistemology and metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
How do we know what a right action is and what makes an action right? Those are fundamental aspects which underpin ethics. Ethics underpins political philosophy, and it kind of all comes around in circles. Logic underpins all of philosophy, and so basically math underpins philosophy. So everything's connected. I don't know if everything in degrees, I'm not going to say that the abstracts fields of metaphysics are necessarily relevant, but they're important. All the fields are equally important. One of my friends, he's writing a paper on ethics right now for his senior thesis, and he's engaging in a lot of biology. So philosophy can be as engaged as you want. I'm writing a paper on Aristotle right now, on Aristotelian ethics, and I'm working with a guy whose primary field of study is consciousness. It's like Mr. Parsons is saying, all connected. So to bring it back to Ado's point here, I think all of philosophy can help you reach this stage of flourishing, but I'm not sure if all areas of philosophy will help you do that.
Yeah, I think it'd probably be best to say, certain fields of philosophy will get you there quicker.
Yeah.
If that's what you're interested in, how to live a good life.
That's the sound of money. Fresh, printed money.
Hey, Andrew, have you ever been on a boat?
I love boats. Boats are great. Good to go fishing in, riding around, help transport your car so your car doesn't have to sink in the ocean when you need to go across it. All very fun.
Has that been something you've required in your life many times? Just transport your boat across the ocean.
Have you ever?
Transport your car across the ocean.
Have you ever seen that Office episode where Michael, the navigation system, tells him he needs to cross the lake, and he drives his car into the pond or whatever?
So stupid. Oh boy. Yeah. All right. Well, sounds like you do have some experience with boats. But have you ever been on a boat so fancy it would be considered a yacht?
I don't think so.
Yeah, me neither. But hey, this week's sponsor, it may be outside of the financial dimensions of some of our, if not most of our listeners, but hey, it pays the bills. We'd like to introduce you to the Theseus Yacht Club.
That's right. Tired of spending your days on some dinky little boat? Chuck off those proletarian trappings and enter the world of ridiculous and totally irresponsible bourgeois luxury by joining the Theseus Yacht Club.
Just imagine yourself stepping out onto the deck of your yacht on a beautiful sunny day at sea. A pathetic urchin whose name you don't even have to know brings you a mimosa to help you recover from last night's hangover while looking out onto the crystalline waters of the Mediterranean.
Well, joining the Theseus Yacht Club, you'll not only receive a spot in one of their many exclusive harbors around the coast of Greece, you'll also get a polo shirt with a super cool yacht club emblem, the yachting captain's hat, and a commemorative ascot, a sense of outrageous self-entitlement.
Oh, yeah. And the best part of being a member is, if your ship is in need of any repairs while out at sea, such as replacing planks in the deck, patching holes in the hull, or even having to replace the crew, you'll still retain rights to the ship, even though everything has physically changed.
That seems like a really weird guarantee, but hey, what do I know? I'm just a struggling college student whose loans would be really difficult for me to pay back, but aren't even enough to be able to sniff at being part of a yacht.
Well, my friend, we all make choices. You should have been born into a family that has a vast amount of money. But anyway, thank you to the Ship of Theseus Yacht Club for sponsoring us today. And of course, thank you to all of our listeners. Bi-weekly schedule. Check in with what we've been talking about. We love that you do that. Thank you for listening, and thank you for passing along Open Door Philosophy to your friends, strangers, people you meet in the supermarket, wherever you encounter people, unless you're a hermit.
There's this passage, I really like section 2, even though I have some problems with it, but I really like this discussion about dialogues. He says Platonic dialogues are these model exercises, they're not meant to be real, blah, 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 blah. And he has this really good commentary, I think, about what these dialogues are meant to do. They're a necessary condition for these dialogues, for the person in those dialogues, as a model, I think, for ourselves, is that nothing's going to happen to Socrates' interlocutor if they're firm fixed in their position. In my Socrates class, my professor always said that the interlocutor always has to be honest in their conversation. They have to be espousing their own views and really believe those views, and they also have to be willing to fairly engage in those dialogues. I'm thinking of Thrasymachus in Republic, where he's very hostile to Socrates. And so that's those two conditions for having a successful dialogue. Edo is stressing and saying that that's something that we need to do when we're entering into a philosophical dialogue, whether that's going to be reading a work of philosophy or just having a philosophical discussion like Mr. Parsons and I are having now. It's really not enough to be held firm in your position, allowing yourself to be open. So, Mr. Parsons, again, I have a good idea of what you're going to say about this, but what do you think about this idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think about today's political discourse, which is probably not the greatest thing to talk about, but people in the United States anyway, but it seems that this is true also in Europe with politics, which means it's probably true in all areas of politics. People become so ensconced, is that the right word, in their political views, which political views are an expression of personal values, right? That they become so adherent to it, they refuse to accept anything outside of what they believe to be true and right. And that doesn't move the democratic engine forward at all. It just creates a bunch of gears with no oil, right? Like the whole thing just locks up, and that helps no one. And so whether we're talking about something like political discourse, which, is dialoguing, and it's important to think about this when we talk about dialoguing. That's kind of a fancy term, dialoguing, interlocutors. It's people talking with each other, right? And, it shouldn't be rhetorical. It shouldn't be someone attempting to make a point. This isn't a debate. A dialogue is different than a debate. A debate, you are trying to win. A dialogue is that you are investigating different ideas with another person or with yourself. So whether it's political discourse or whether it's any other sort of discourse, it's important to be open because if you're not, well, I mean, there's no point in even doing it, frankly. Go back to your little corner of social media and live there in your silo, which doesn't help anyone, but whatever.
No, I think that's a great example. It's really a feature of all throughout time of politicians not really of doing the same thing that they're known for today. I think that's that's like a very evident thing in Plato.
I mean, Socrates complained about the politicians 2,500 years ago. So yeah.
I don't think it's not going to be a surprise to anybody, but that's okay. It's kind of like a not be them kind of way. And
let me jump in and say though, like what Edo is trying to say here is that it's about you, not really the other person. You can't control the other person's willingness to be honest in a dialogue, but you can control your own willingness to be honest in dialogue. And you have to be aware of that. You have to be self-reflective, because it's just as easy to complain about the other person in the other silo when you got to look at yourself too and be like, okay, am I being open and honest and dialoguing, or am I really just debating, trying to prove my point? So you can't control the other person, but you can control yourself. And so if you're talking about spiritual exercises in improving this aspect of you, boy, that's something you got to do, which is to be, self-reflective and critical of your own self.
I definitely think that's right. He makes this distinction between dialectic and rhetoric, saying it's not, you don't really need to engage in rhetoric. You need to engage in dialectic. And they're different. Not the dialectic that Hegel is going to be advocating for, but the Socratic of question and answer, not these kind of long speeches that are just meant to persuade. This is exactly what I was going to bring up that I didn't really like. I didn't like the language that he used here. Basically, because I think of just what you were saying. He reads this quote from exactly sure who, but he reads this quote: "To emerge victorious from this battle, it's not enough to disclose the truth. It's not even enough to demonstrate it. What is needed is persuasion, and for that one must use psychology, the art of seducing souls. Even at that, it's not enough to use only rhetoric. What is needed above all is dialectic." And I think that I don't love that term, to emerge victorious from this battle. And I get what he means there, and it's useful language, but I don't like that word, emerge victorious from this battle, because I don't think it really should be a battle. It shouldn't be viewed as a battle, and it shouldn't be viewed as something, a dialogue shouldn't be viewed as something that you're going to win. It's not something that you're going to think of coming away from a battle victorious leads this connotation of someone winning and someone losing. I don't think that's what he's advocating for. And I just kind of want to make that clear. It's not something that you're going to win. That's the point of dialectic. The point is to come to truth. So if it is going to be this battle and you're going to become victorious away from it, it's not going to be winning out of a debate from two people. It's going to be winning by gaining a greater understanding.
Yeah, well, this is really spinning off in a lot of areas for me. I think about Plato's allegory of the cave. So you have the prisoner who's released, and he exits the cave, metaphor for darkness and ignorance, and steps into the light of knowledge and understands truth in a more expansive way than those left behind in the cave, those prisoners in the cave. Yet, when the dialogue comes to the portion of asking, well, now that the released prisoner is more understanding of what truth is, what is the prisoner's what is the released prisoner's task? Is it to stay out of the cave where he is in the light of the sun, the light of knowledge, or is it to go back into the cave? And Plato clearly states that it is the task of that enlightened person to go back down into the cave and sit with those people who are ignorant. And he says, I think I'm quoting this correctly, and accept their honors, whether they are worth having or not. And so when you talk about doing battle and becoming victorious, when the released prisoner goes back down into the bottom of the cave and he attempts to explain to them what a tree is or what a rock is or something, or a bird, and they have a total different conception of that. What does battle look like in that situation? If you're this person like the released prisoner, is it battle, or is it, accepting their honors, whether it's worth having or not? So I don't know. Whatever reason, when you mentioned battle, that's the thing that popped in my head, was like, these are the people that perhaps we're talking about, people who might be on different ideological lines. Is battle the best thing?
I don't think I have anything else to add. I think that's a pretty good comment that you made.
Well, then let me extend then on the battle metaphor, because he uses it a couple times in the text. And he specifically says at one point, and I think it's in section 2, but it might be in a couple different parts of the section, but he says, dialogue, and we must engage in battle with ourselves.
Yeah.
And, he also talks about how switched on Stoics have to be in the moment, and always analyzing, always being self-reflective, always being switched on. And then I think about engaging in battle with yourself, in terms of self-reflection and things like that. So this idea of being so mentally intense does sort of go opposite to some other wisdom traditions that suggest the thing to do is to actually not be super critical of what you do, but to empty your mind and empty yourself. And whether we're talking about Buddhism or Taoism or some other Eastern tradition that advocates for an Eastern type of meditation, not the meditation that Ado talks about, but the Eastern type of meditation where we observe our actions, we observe our thoughts, and then we let them go into the universe. I don't know which is right or which is better, but there are other traditions out there that suggest that being this intensive of our own actions is not the recommended course towards happiness.
That's a very good observation. Definitely did not think about that, and I think that is a difference that you're going to see in the divide between Western and Eastern philosophy. I think I'm not at least familiar with any ancient school of philosophy that's going to say something similar to that, but there could be. I don't know, I think that's a really good point. I think I personally would say it's really, well, I don't even know if I can't really comment on Eastern philosophy because I know little to nothing about it. And you know way more than me about this, Mr. Parsons. So correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just going to take a stab in the dark here.
Okay.
So could be completely wrong, but I'm just guessing. I'm guessing the difference lies in the two. Again, this is a guess in the school's belief in what the human condition is going to be like. I think through these ancient philosophers and these Hellenistic schools, I think they're going to say, like the natural condition of human beings is not the optimal state. And it can be improved, and just allowing ourselves to be and to be kind of zen and whatever is not going to lead us to be the best versions of ourselves. In Eastern school might say just letting ourselves be and letting ourselves be what we're meant to be as human beings might allow us to reach this optimal state of humankind. Is that somewhat right?
Yeah, like in the Taoist tradition, the idea of following nature, which is the Tao. The Tao is the greatest expression of nature, is to be dark and mysterious and empty. And because the more things that we pack into that box that is us, takes us further away from our truest essence. But I also want to point out that, and it's speaking so superficially here of Eastern philosophy. Of course, there are other Eastern philosophies that don't advocate for this. Confucianism is a good example. Confucianism is really one of the two great traditions of Eastern philosophy. If you really think of like Taoism and Confucianism as like the yin-yang symbol, those two really undergird a lot of Chinese thought and way to be in the world. And so Confucianism is very, like, it's all focused on order and duties and discipline and all of that stuff, which is very much so not emptying yourself. So I don't want to be, superficial and say like, oh, Eastern philosophy is like emptying yourself. But yes, like Zen Buddhism, Taoism, those types of things certainly advocate for that. But, I think from an Eastern perspective, it's kind of again, the yin yang symbol, sort of a melding of those two true traditions, the light and the dark.
I think we could do an entire episode on this too, but I just want to mention quickly, like, it's really fascinating because both this idea of nature, of following nature, both Western and Eastern philosophy, I guess, tends to want to follow nature.
Yeah.
Where there's a big emphasis on nature. Stoicism, as everybody who's listened to our last 4 episodes, or I guess, our last 4 episodes before this series knows, nature plays a big part in Stoicism. It plays a big part in all of these Hellenistic schools.
Yeah, and actually, like section 3 of this essay is contemplating nature.
I'm always happy to talk about death, like we said on this on our last episode.
Yeah, let's do it.
So let's talk about
death.
Let's talk about death for a little bit at least. Just people who might have the text or the PDF or whatever in front of them. On page 95, Ado is talking about learning to die, training for death, which sounds so weird, for, I think, anyone outside of this philosophical context, training for death, oh my gosh, what does that mean? But Ado says, training for death is training to die to one's individuality and passions in order to look at things from one's perspective of universality and objectivity. And later down the page, he says, to present philosophy as training for death was a decision of paramount importance, as Socrates' interlocutor in the Phaedo was quick to remark, such a characterization would be laughable. But for anyone who takes philosophy seriously, however, this Platonic dictum is profoundly true. And then Ado goes on to claim that this idea of training to die, this Platonic training to die dictum, has been influential in Western philosophy. Mr. Parsons, we talked about this a little bit last week. Obviously, we both think that, or maybe not obviously, I think I've been trying to figure out who ingrained into me that saying obviously is kind of dumb, and I think that was you. But
obviously.
But I think we both think that philosophy is useful in thinking about death. But why do you think that's so? Why is philosophy such a good way of thinking about getting ready for death, and why is that important?
Oh, geez, this is like a whole episode. So death is something that every single human being will experience, and no one knows what's on the other side of that. And so it freaks people out. So I think that's why it's important to think about it. I also think it's important to think about it because oftentimes, and it's so horrible when it happens, but, sometimes there are untimely deaths in our lives, relatives, friends. And we wrestle with that. We grapple with why does that happen? We want to know an answer to why. And so what's the point of us being here if we're all going to die? Why are people taken from us in inopportune times? Why do things like cancer happen? All of this stuff, those are big questions. And people need to have some tools and some ways to think about that topic so that they can grapple with it. And then, of course, eventually you come to your own death. That's why I think it's important to think about. And I think philosophy, especially in the West, has dealt with that in a lot of different ways. And so, again, just like with anything that's recommendable about how to live a good life is also, knowing how to die. A lot of the Stoics will say, well, Seneca, life is long if you know how to live it. And everything is framed by death. The American poet Wallace Stevens is famous for saying, death is the mother of beauty. Only the perishable can be beautiful, which is why we are unmoved by artificial flowers. Death frames everything in a way. We forget that it's there. Life is long. And so we forget about death from time to time. But the reason that things are enjoyable, the reason things are beautiful is because that thing will eventually end. Again, I go back to thinking about my philosophy higher level students that are getting ready to leave in about a week and a half. I'm very fond of them. I love them. They're so important to me. And the things that we've done this year in class, maybe they're more meaningful, maybe they're more special because I know that there's going to be an end to that. And into that relationship as far as collectively, as us as a group of students and teachers, but also, those individuals, they're moving on as they should to go on to do other things. And I think this is why death is important in terms of ending, because how absurd would it be if those students were in my class for 30 years? I mean, that would be weird. And no one wants that.
And even that would come to an end.
Even that would come to an end, right? So, things become more meaningful, more purposeful. Things are framed as more important when we know that there is an end to things. So whether that's the death of a relationship or a relationship in that way, or whether that's literally the death of the body, of the consciousness, I think that's why death is such an important thing, and making peace with that as best as we can.
This is another life update that I haven't talked about since maybe our second or third episode. But since then, I've become a huge avid Sopranos fan.
Oh, yeah. I remember you mentioning that once.
I think I just started the series when we first started this podcast, and I was watching this video. I couldn't fall asleep. I woke up really early this morning and I couldn't fall asleep. So I was watching this video, and they were talking about, I think it's Livia, Tony's mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of the comments saying like, she's just ready to die or something. And so I don't know. I don't know why that's just coming in my head, but I guess death we think of as this very scary, very sad thing. And it is. It's a very sad experience. But I think if you ask probably 1,000 people, I bet you 999 of them, or maybe all 1,000 of them would say that they wouldn't want to live forever. And so there's something kind of beautiful that in that too.
Mm-hmm.
Let me end this section unless you want to say anything else by how Ado ends this section, because I think it's really kind of beautiful in itself. And I'm going to paraphrase it to make it end up better. But he says that death is than that, in a fleeting blaze of life, a metamorphosis of the self.
Mm.
So I think that's a very good way to end that section.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. It reminds me of John Donne's Meditation 17, where he talks about the death of a person is that person being a chapter in a book, and that chapter is being translated into a new language. And that new language is what comes after death. So that same quote you mentioned on page 95, training for death is training to die to one's individuality and passions in order to look at things from the perspective of universality and objectivity. So Ado here is not talking about physical death of the body. He's talking about physical death of the ego. Not physical death,
Yep.
but the death of the ego. Training to die to one's individuality and passions, which of course, like he states throughout the work, that's the work of reason, right? To suppress and transcend those passions. But the term individuality kind of caught my attention, and it makes me think of Buddhism, in how there is like this notion of your individuality doesn't actually exist. There is no self. And that all the things that we are attached to, our relationships, our possessions, our money, any of those types of things are just nasty old caked on stuff to our truest form. And if we can get rid of those things, our truest form, which is no self, can emerge. I mean, I know Ado is certainly not appealing to Buddhism here, but I did think of that connection, right? As a training to die to one's individuality and passions. And is that it? Passions I get, but when you throw individuality, is that sort of a negation of self and of identity? What do you think?
I don't know if I'm overly qualified to answer this question, but I don't know. I guess it depends how we're thinking of ego, if it's essential to the self. And I'm not sure I don't know if Ado is thinking about maybe like the death of an ego and the way like of destroying like what Freud would consider to be the ego as like a central part of the self. It's probably just meaning like this ego in colloquial terms. I don't even know, like maybe like our overconfidence or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I'm not sure if it would be that big of a destruction of the self. If it's, oh yeah, like my overconfidence in, I don't know, like gardening or something like that, or philosophy.
A new thought experiment, the overconfident gardener.
I don't know. Maybe if, okay, say, which I definitely don't think this, but say like I have a huge ego when it comes to gardening or something.
Yes.
I know nothing. I know nothing about gardening, by the way, for listeners.
I have the best
Although
roses.
Mr. Parsons is, yeah, Mr. Parsons is so much more knowledgeable. My mom, I come from a great lineage of gardeners. My mom and I know my grandfather for sure, and my grandmother all love gardening. I think on both sides of my family. So that is not passed to me. But say like, oh yeah, I confident that I can grow the best oranges or the best roses or something. Probably me losing that ego by engaging in some spiritual exercises would probably allow me to grow even better oranges or something. I don't know how it works, but I'm just assuming that's how it works. So maybe it is in a sense like I'm not going to have that identity that I'm the best gardener or something, but it'll probably make me a better gardener. And I don't know if anything I said makes sense. But,
well, so how about this? I was kind of thinking about this in terms of the Platonic idea of the world of forms and everything. And the closer we get to the world of forms, rather to say, the ideal form of beauty or good, that the further we move up that hierarchy, if you will, that the Platonists use, the more abstracted it becomes, right? The more abstracted beauty becomes, the more abstracted justice becomes, the more abstracted the good. I mean, the good is about as abstract as you can get. Like, what the heck is that? So we're talking about ourselves elevating, especially in a Neoplatonist view, from a sort of religious aspect. The more we elevate towards the good, the more abstracted as individuals we become. And I think I have that right. And I don't know that that is something that would appeal to a lot of people. But I think of it too in like the Taoist or the Buddhist, Zen Buddhist. It's the same idea, is to sort of put off these shackles of the things that bind us to this world. And the more we get rid of those, whether it's passions in the Western sense or whether it's desires in the Eastern sense, the more we become our true self. But that true self is more abstracted.
I see what you mean. I mean, yeah, that's like, you're right about a Platonist. That's exactly what they're going to want. Like, the best life for a Platonist is going to be a life of contemplation. The Latin that's used a lot, vita contemplativa is like the ideal life, not just for Platonists, but for probably for a lot of like professors and people in academia too. I don't know if that's like true. I don't think a Stoic would necessarily think that's true. A Platonist would think that's true. An Aristotelian wouldn't think that's true. I don't know. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I mean, I can see why people would really enjoy that life.
Yeah. Now I'm trying to articulate, maybe even in the Christian sense, when some people will say something like, lose yourself in Christ or lose yourself in God. Let God become your identity. Is not the same thing, but it may be sort of similar. All right, everybody, we're done. It's over. We had a great time. I hope that you had a great time listening too.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun talking about those spiritual exercises and his book, Philosophy is a Way of Life. You can check out a link to that book on our website, www.opendoorphilosophy.com. You can check out more of the podcast at Open Door Philosophy. You can check out Mr. Parsons' Twitter, D_Parsonage. That's right.
That's right.
Awesome. I got it down. And you can also check out our email if you ever want to get in touch with us, opendoorphilosophy@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, please send us an email. We're so tired of looking at ads from car insurance companies and stuff. Or being approved for loans. Yeah, if you email us, we'll approve you for a loan. We have enough of those. This was a fun episode, man. We just got to sort of shoot from the hip on some of these topics that we had about the reading, and I think in a way that's a bit of what philosophy is about. So yeah, guys, engage with us online. It's a whole lot of fun. I've been putting a lot more stuff up on the Instagram lately, so you might enjoy some of that. Sort of an extension of the show, if you will. Hey, as always, thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the use of his free music. It's so groovy. We just you're listening to it literally right now. Isn't it so great? This track is called Wallpaper.
Do you want to give them a hint about what's upcoming for our next episode?
Oh my gosh, yes. So we're going to have a guest on to talk about thought experiments, Helen DeCruz. She is very well published and well known, and we're excited to have her on the show about her new book, Philosophical Illustrations. And then after that, we're going to begin a series on something that has been long in coming, and I can't believe we haven't done anything on it yet. And that's going to be philosophy of religion. So that'll be good times too.
Well, anyway, looking forward to those and looking forward to hearing from everybody. That's going to be it for this week's episode. Remember, if your life's in need of some philosophy, the door is always going to be open.
Yeah, see ya.
See ya. Yeah, if the royal family is listening and wants to send me some a few million pounds or whatever their currency is, I'm always happy to.
Well, it depends on what royal family it is. and what currency they'd use.
That's true. I was thinking about like the English royal family. Maybe we can ask Jack Symes to set us up.
I know he's got those connections. Well, you'll be in Italy soon, so maybe you can. I don't know that they have a royal family anymore. They probably do. I don't know. Europeans and the royals, Yeah. Maybe it's more like captains of industry over there or something.
Maybe like Gucci or
Versace or something.
Versace, yeah.
Yeah, those are the royalty. I bet you they have yachts. I bet they have a whole fleet of yachts.
Sure. That'd be pretty cool. Yeah. I'll hijack one of them back to the U.S. and we can record our episodes on there in Galveston Yacht Club.
Oh, do it, man. Oh, the beautiful waters of Galveston. Yes. Out there with all the oil shipping containers and everything.
Yeah. We need to have an advertisement from like Galveston Crabbing Company or something.
Oh, we do. We just got to figure out how to. Isn't there there's probably some New England philosopher that enjoyed crabbing? I would say Hemingway, but he's not a philosopher.
Yeah.
All right, good stuff. Okay, let's see here. So now that we're 40 plus minutes in, we haven't even gotten to section 2.